A woman sits alone in a hotel room in Cairo, in the dark. Her marriage has just ended. She is deep in debt, overweight, out of work, and she reaches for a cigarette. But this time, she doesn't light it. In that one small moment, she decides to change the single thing she believes she can control. 4 years later, doctors slide her into a brain scanner and find something that should be impossible. The neural patterns that once ran her life have been physically crowded out by new ones. She has lost 60 pounds, run a marathon, gone back to school, bought a house. Her name is Lisa Allen, and her brain is about to teach scientists the most hopeful thing they have ever learned about us: that habits aren't destiny. Here is what stunned the researchers. Lisa hadn't fixed her life piece by piece. She had changed one habit, smoking, and it set off a chain reaction that quietly rewired everything else. Scientists have a name for a habit like that. They call it a keystone habit. Pull the right one, and the whole structure shifts. But that raises a stranger question. If a single habit can reshape an entire life, what exactly is a habit? Where does it even live inside us? Because it turns out that nearly half of what you do each day isn't a decision at all. One study found that more than 40% of our daily actions are habits, choices that feel like choices but aren't. To understand why, scientists needed a man who had lost his mind but kept his habits. His name was Eugene Pauly. In the studies, simply EP, a viral infection had devoured his memory. He could not tell you what year it was, could not recognize the scientist who visited him every week, could not draw a map of the house he lived in. Ask him where the kitchen was, and he would stare at you, lost. And yet, when he got hungry, Eugene would stand up, walk through that house, go straight to the kitchen, and get himself a snack, then deny he had ever left his chair. His wife once panicked when he wandered off on a walk and drove the neighborhood searching for him. She found him at home. He could not have told you the route. His body knew it anyway. Somewhere beneath memory, something was still steering him. What was it? The answer was hiding in a lump of tissue near the center of the brain, no bigger than a golf ball, called the basal ganglia. At MIT, researchers ran rats through a T-shaped maze with a piece of chocolate at one end. Each run began with a click as a little door slid open. At first, the rat wandered, sniffing, searching, and its brain roared with activity the whole way. But as it learned the maze, something eerie happened. The mental activity faded. The rat ran flawlessly to the chocolate, while its brain went nearly silent, firing hard at only 2 moments: the click at the start and the reward at the end. The brain had bundled the entire routine into one automatic package. And inside that pattern, scientists finally saw the shape of every habit you have. Every habit, they realized, runs on the same simple loop. First, a cue, a trigger that tells your brain which routine to launch and to stop paying attention. Then, the routine itself, the behavior, the thing you do. And finally, a reward, the payoff that tells your brain this loop is worth saving for next time. Cue, routine, reward. That is the machinery running underneath Eugene's walk to the kitchen. Underneath your reach for your phone, your coffee, your nails. Your brain builds these loops on purpose because they let it stop working, power down, and coast. It is brilliant. It is also dangerous, because a brain that is coasting cannot tell a good habit from a self-destructive one. It just runs them both. So the real question becomes, if this is how a habit works, how do you build a brand new one from scratch? A century ago, a salesman named Claude Hopkins was handed an impossible job: sell Americans toothpaste. The problem? Almost nobody brushed their teeth. So Hopkins went hunting for a trigger, a cue, and he found it in one simple idea: the film. That fuzzy coating you can feel on your teeth with your tongue. Go ahead, run your tongue across your teeth right now, and you will feel it. Hopkins promised that his toothpaste, Pepsodent, would scrub that film away and hand you a beautiful smile. Within a decade, half of America was brushing every day. He had built a national habit almost overnight. There was just one catch. The film he had declared war on is natural, harmless, and Pepsodent didn't actually remove it. The product barely worked. So why did tens of millions of people get hooked on using it every single day? The secret wasn't in the teeth, it was in a tingle. Pepsodent was laced with citric acid and oil of mint, ingredients that did nothing for your smile, but left your mouth cool and prickling. Miss a brushing, and people felt that something was wrong. They didn't crave clean teeth, they craved the tingle. And craving, scientists discovered, is the hidden engine of every habit. In a lab in Cambridge, a researcher watched a monkey named Julio learn to expect a drop of juice whenever a shape flashed on a screen. At first, Julio's pleasure spiked the instant the juice arrived, but as the habit set in, that spike jumped backward in time to the moment the shape appeared before a single drop had touched his tongue. His brain now wanted it in advance, and when the juice was taken away, that wanting curdled into frustration. That is craving. That is the roaring monster in your head the moment you smell a cinnamon roll you weren't even hungry for. Ignore craving, and even a miracle product dies. When Procter & Gamble invented Febreze, a spray that erased odors from the air, they thought they were holding gold. They aimed it at the worst smells imaginable, and it flopped. They found a woman living with 9 cats in a home so overpowering a visitor could barely breathe. She loved Febreze, but never thought to buy it because she couldn't smell her own house. The cue was invisible to the very people who needed it most. Febreze was about to be canceled. Then researchers noticed something in the footage. A woman finished cleaning a room, smoothed the bed, and gave the air a little spritz. Not to kill a stink, but as a tiny flourish, a reward. A moment of, I'm done, it's perfect. So the company relaunched Febreze, not as a cleaner, but as the pleasant finish to cleaning, the sparkle at the end. Sales exploded into the hundreds of millions. They hadn't found a smell to kill. They had planted a craving, which raises a darker question. If a craving can be built, can a bad one be broken? For most of history, the answer looked like no. Once a habit takes hold, it never truly leaves. But a quiet football coach named Tony Dungy built his entire career on a loophole. Dungy took over losing teams, and he refused to hand his players thick playbooks. His radical bet was this: you cannot erase a bad habit. You can only change it. Every habit runs on that same loop: cue, routine, reward, and here is the key. The cue and the reward can stay exactly the same. You only swap out the middle. Keep the old trigger, keep the old payoff, but feed the brain a new routine in between. Dungy didn't try to make his players think faster. He rewired their automatic reactions so that when a play unfolded, the cue, they moved instantly, without deliberating, to the right response. Champions, he said, don't do extraordinary things. They do ordinary things without thinking, too fast for the other team to react. The same loophole explains how people escape far darker habits. Alcoholics Anonymous has helped millions stop drinking, and for decades, nobody could say exactly why it worked. Look closely, and it is the golden rule in disguise. A person doesn't only crave the alcohol, they crave what it gives them. The relief, the escape, the company at the bar, a way to switch off after a brutal day. So the program doesn't try to erase that craving. It keeps the same cues and the same rewards, and slips a new routine into the gap. A meeting instead of a drink, a sponsor's voice instead of a glass, a room full of people chasing the very same relief. Same cue, same reward, new routine, and for a while, it works beautifully. But then life delivers a real blow, a death, a lost job, and people who had been sober for years suddenly relapse. The loop had been rebuilt. So why did it crack? Something was still missing. The missing piece was belief. Researchers found that the people who lasted weren't the ones with the strongest willpower. They were the ones who had come to believe, deep down, that change was genuinely possible. And crucially, they didn't believe it alone. They believed it together. It wasn't faith in any particular God that mattered, the scientists concluded. It was belief itself. And a community was what made that belief hold when life tried to shatter it. Tony Dungy learned the same truth in the hardest way a person can. For years, his players trusted his system until a private tragedy struck his own family and nearly broke him. What carried his team through wasn't a new play. It was that they had finally fully believed together, and that shared belief turned a good system into an unstoppable one. A single person can rebuild a single habit, but belief is what makes it survive, and that hinted at something much bigger. If belief could bind a team, what could a habit do to an entire company? In 1987, the aluminum giant Alcoa got a new chief executive, and Wall Street gathered to hear his plan. Paul O'Neill stood in front of a room of investors expecting talk of profits and margins, and he said, "I want to talk to you about worker safety." The room went quiet. He didn't mention earnings. He pointed out the fire exits. He announced that he intended to make Alcoa the safest company in America and to go for 0 injuries. One investor bolted from the room, called his biggest clients, and told them to sell every share immediately. A company run by some safety nut was surely doomed. It was, he later admitted, the single worst piece of advice he gave in his entire career. Because O'Neill hadn't lost his mind. He had just found the one lever that would move everything else. O'Neill had found what is called a keystone habit. One habit that, when it starts to shift, quietly dislodges and remakes all the others around it. Safety was perfect for it. To make a plant safer, you had to understand why workers were getting hurt, which meant fixing broken processes, which meant managers and floor workers had to actually talk to each other, which meant the whole rusted machine of the company had to start communicating and improving. He built it as a loop. An injury was the cue. The routine was that everyone, all the way up to O'Neill himself, had to hear about it within 24 hours, along with a plan to prevent the next one. And the reward was that the people who embraced it were the ones who got promoted. Safety was the small win that made bigger wins feel possible. By the time O'Neill left, Alcoa's injury rate had fallen to a 20th of the American average, and the company's worth had climbed by billions. One habit. A transformed giant. How deep did it go? One day, a young worker who had taken the job so his pregnant wife could have health insurance was killed trying to fix a machine. O'Neill didn't send out a memo. He gathered his executives, and he said, "We killed this man. It was my failure of leadership. I caused his death," and he meant it. In most companies, an accident is a line in a report. At O'Neill's Alcoa, it was a sacred breach of the one habit everything else hung on. That is what a keystone habit feels like from the inside. Not a rule on a poster, but an identity so complete that a single failure lands like a wound. Change the keystone, and you don't just change what people do, you change who they believe they are. And when a keystone habit takes hold in one person, it can look like magic. Beijing, 2008. Michael Phelps dives into the pool for an Olympic final, and instantly, his goggles begin to fill with water. Mid-race, he goes effectively blind. For most swimmers, that is panic. For Phelps, it was just one more rehearsal. Every night for years, his coach had told him to watch the videotape, a slow, vivid mental movie of the perfect race, replayed before sleep and on waking, until it ran automatically. He had even trained in blacked-out goggles on purpose. So now, blind in the water, he simply counted his strokes, exactly as the tape in his mind had rehearsed 1,000 times. He touched the wall, tore off his goggles, and looked up at the clock. World record. His body had run the routine his habits had built. No eyes required. But there is one keystone habit that matters more than any other, for a company or for a single person, and it isn't grand. It is willpower. In a now famous experiment, hungry students were led one at a time into a room that smelled of fresh-baked cookies. Some were allowed to eat the cookies. Others were told to resist them and to eat radishes instead. Then everyone was handed a tricky puzzle to solve. The cookie eaters worked at it for 19 minutes. The radish eaters, who had just burned through their self-control resisting temptation, gave up and ate. And the discovery underneath was revolutionary. Willpower isn't a fixed trait you are simply born with or without. It is a muscle. It gets tired when you overuse it. And, exactly like a muscle, it grows stronger the more you train it. Learn to master one small thing, and the strength quietly spills into everything else, which is the hopeful heart of this whole science. Habits aren't destiny. Starbucks bet a fortune on that idea. Many of the young people it hired arrived with almost no self-discipline. One of them, Travis Leach, had grown up in a home ruled by addiction, dialing for an ambulance to save a collapsing parent before he was even 10 years old. What Starbucks taught him wasn't really coffee. It was willpower, turned into a habit. The company trained its workers to decide in advance exactly how they would respond at the hardest moments, the inflection points, a screaming customer, a line out the door, so that when the cue hit, the trained routine fired automatically, no agonizing required. They even gave the routines names, like a script for staying calm under fire. Travis learned to tell himself that his apron was a shield, that nothing anyone said could ever hurt him. The chaos that had raised him didn't vanish. He simply had a routine ready for it now, and self-control, once it became a habit, stopped feeling like a fight. But habits don't only build people up, they can quietly kill. Deep inside every organization are unspoken truces. You don't question my department, I won't question yours. Routines that keep the peace and sometimes keep everyone blind. In one hospital, a culture where nurses didn't dare challenge domineering surgeons ended with an elderly man operated on the wrong side of his head. In London, in 1987, a lit match slipped through a wooden escalator in the King's Cross subway station. A staffer spotted the small flame, but putting out fires wasn't his department, so he walked away. Minutes later, a fireball erupted up into the crowded ticket hall, and 31 people died. And here is the pattern investigators keep finding. These deadly habits almost never change in calm times. They change only in the wreckage of a crisis. Which is why the wisest leaders, one famously said, never let a serious crisis go to waste. They use the disaster to force the new habit through. By now, you might feel like the master of your own habits, but there are people who understand your loops better than you do, and they are counting on you not to notice. At Target, a statistician named Andrew Pohl was handed a startling assignment: figure out which shoppers were pregnant before they had told anyone at all. Why pregnancy? Because our buying habits are set in concrete, except at a few enormous life moments, like a new baby, when they crack wide open and can be reshaped. Pohl studied mountains of shopping data until he could spot the subtle shifts. Unscented lotion, certain vitamins, suddenly buying extra cotton balls, and from them, assign a woman a pregnancy score. One day, an angry father stormed into a store, furious that Target had mailed his teenage daughter coupons for cribs and baby clothes. The manager apologized. A few days later, the father called back, embarrassed. His daughter was indeed due in August. The company had known before he did. But Target had a problem. When the pregnancy coupons were too accurate, women felt watched and stopped buying. So Pohl's team hid the truth in plain sight. They buried the baby coupons among random, unrelated products, a wine glass, a lawnmower, so that a pregnant woman would just assume everyone on her street had gotten the very same flyer. Dress a new thing in old, familiar habits, and people swallow it without resistance. It is the same trick radio stations use to make you love a song you would normally skip. They sandwich the strange new track between two songs you already can't resist, and your brain, riding its comfortable groove, quietly accepts the stranger. Habits are the lever. Companies simply know where to push, and if a hidden loop can move a shopper without her ever knowing, a chilling thought follows. Could the same force move an entire society? December 1955. In Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress named Rosa Parks refuses to give up her bus seat to a white man, and she is arrested. Black residents had been mistreated on those buses for generations. Others had been arrested before her for the very same thing. So why did this arrest, this particular woman, ignite a movement that changed a nation? Part of the answer is who Rosa Parks was. She wasn't only a quiet seamstress. She sat at the crossroads of dozens of different social circles. She knew the wealthy and the poor, church groups and community boards. She was respected and loved across every layer of the city. So when she was thrown in jail, it wasn't a stranger in trouble, it was everyone's friend. And the strong bonds of friendship lit the very first spark. But friendship alone cannot sustain a boycott for a year. Something wider had to carry it. That something was the power of weak ties. Your acquaintances, your neighbors, the people you barely know. Sociologists discovered that movements spread not mainly through our closest friends, but through this vast web of loose connections, powered by a force we rarely like to admit to: peer pressure. In Montgomery, the boycott held because to keep riding the bus now meant facing your entire community, your neighbors, your congregation, the man at the corner shop. The social cost of breaking ranks grew heavier than the cost of walking miles to work in the heat. The habits of a community, the quiet expectations of the people all around us, turned individual courage into a wall of collective will. For more than a year, the buses ran empty. But even that kind of pressure fades with time. For a movement to truly last, it has to become something deeper than pressure. It has to become who people are. That final shift is the strangest and most powerful of all. A movement survives when it hands people new habits and a whole new sense of self. When Martin Luther King's own house was bombed, a furious crowd gathered outside, ready for violence. King stopped them, and he taught the boycotters to answer hatred with non-violence, not as a single heroic choice, but as a daily practice, a habit of the heart, until it became simply who they were. Decades later, a pastor named Rick Warren grew one of the largest churches in America using that very same engine. He didn't lean on his sermons. He built small groups that gave people new weekly habits until faith wasn't something you attended on Sunday. It was something you lived. This is how a spark becomes a fire that will not go out. Friendship lights it, community spreads it, and new habits, woven into identity, make it permanent. The loop doesn't just run a life or a company, it can remake the world. Which leaves us with one last, deeply uncomfortable question. If so much of what we do runs on automatic, are we truly responsible for any of it? Consider two people. A woman in Iowa, lonely and bored, drifts into a riverboat casino one quiet afternoon, and over the years, a gambling habit swells into a compulsion that swallows her family's entire fortune. And a gentle man in Wales who, lost deep in a night terror, his sleeping brain utterly convinced an intruder was attacking, killed his own wife with his hands, and woke to unimaginable horror at what had happened. Both had brains hijacked by automatic patterns they never consciously chose, and yet a court set the sleeping man free, while it held the gambling woman fully to account for every debt. On the surface, that seems exactly backwards. So how could that possibly be fair? The answer turns on a single word: awareness. The sleeping man had no possible way of knowing that the deadly pattern buried in his brain even existed. He had never been warned. He never saw it coming. The gambling woman knew her habit intimately. She had felt its pull, understood its grip, and still, awake and aware, she had the chance to change the routine. And that is the line. Once you know a habit exists, you gain the responsibility to change it. It is an old idea, really. More than a century ago, the psychologist William James, who had clawed his own way up out of despair, wrote a private vow in his diary. "My first act of free will," he wrote, "shall be to believe in free will." He had realized that his life was not a fixed and hopeless fate. It was a mass of habits, and habits, unlike fate, can be rewritten. So here is the real power of habit. Most of us move through our days like a fish in water, surrounded by an invisible current. The cues, the cravings, the automatic routines we never think to question. We call them our choices. They are not. But the moment you can see the loop, the water becomes visible again. You can find the cue that sets a habit off. You can name the reward it is really chasing. And then you can keep that cue, keep that reward, and slip a new routine into the middle with a plan ready for the moment it strikes. It won't be fast, and it won't always be easy, but it is possible. Think back to Lisa Allen, alone in that dark room, choosing not to light one single cigarette. That one small change rewrote her entire life. Your habits are not your destiny. They are what you choose them to be. And now that you can finally see the loop, the only thing left to do is get to work. If this rewired how you see your own days, stay with us, because next we are breaking down Atomic Habits, the field guide to building these loops one tiny step at a time. Until then, see the loop and choose again.